Hi, and welcome to WorkTogether, a podcast brought to you by Social Optic. In this podcast series, we ask experts in their field for their views, thoughts, and advice on topics ranging from technology and data science to organizational culture and psychology. Roll intro. You're joining us for our first episode of the series. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the topic of accessibility, what it is, how it impacts people, and what can be done to improve things in the digital world for any with accessibility needs. Benjamin Ellis is joined by Steve Green, Managing Director of Test Partners. With many years of accessibility and technology experience, Steve brings his unique perspective to the topic, enlightening us on the history of accessibility, diving into the detail of why modern tech can make things challenging for accessibility, and revealing some of the common mistakes and how they can be avoided with good practice. Let's dive in.
So I am joined by Steve, and I am super excited to be having this conversation today. Steve, introduce yourself if you can.
Hi, I'm Steve Green, Managing Director of Test Partners. We're an independent software testing company, and these days we specialise in accessibility testing, training and consultancy.
Brilliant. And we've worked with yourselves for a little bit, and you've definitely helped us up our game on accessibility by a huge margin, which we're very grateful for. For people who are new to accessibility, what does that mean if someone's kind of not familiar with that term, and particularly in the context, obviously here we're talking about surveys and web forms predominantly, but so the digital domain. So what does accessibility mean in that domain?
Right, there's probably any number of definitions out there, but so essentially I think of it in terms of the ability of people to use a website or a mobile application regardless of any disability or access need that they have. And that last phrase is important because not all access needs are the result of a disability. Because I know a lot of people would think accessibility, disability, but there's more to it than that. A lot of people who have access needs wouldn't regard themselves as being disabled at all. So, for instance, most dyslexic people don't think of themselves as having a disability. If, insofar as they think of it at all, they see themselves as just having a different type of ability. And indeed, many of them perceive that they have an advantage over people who are not dyslexic because they think perhaps more creatively or differently. Obviously, people like Richard Branson being one of the examples of that. Also, anyone can find themselves temporarily disabled. So, for instance, if you're using a touchscreen device outside in the sunlight, you'll probably need a higher colour contrast level to read it than you would do indoors, even though there's nothing wrong with your eyesight. Something that's readable inside is less readable outside. And then, of course, there will be situations where perhaps you've got some sort of injury or something and can't use a mouse, so perhaps you're having to use a keyboard to navigate. Again, you wouldn't think of yourself as disabled, but you have a temporary access need. So that is how we think of it.
That's a great set of illustrations. As a dyslexic myself, I resonate with that, and I know that certain fonts and things can render something almost unreadable to me. And similarly, I've got a colleague who fell and broke one of their fingers, and it's interesting how that changes. You can't use a mouse in the same way. It kind of transforms how you use things and makes you realise that some things are not as easy as they could be. So. And there's a broad range of scenarios there. If I'm thinking about a digital survey, a digital web form, what are probably the most common accessibility challenges that I should be thinking about? Obviously, you want to think about the broad range, but what are the most common things that users are likely to encounter?
Right. I'm not sure there's an answer to that one. Without doubt, the noisiest user group are people with visual impairments. And so there may well be a perception that they are the largest group, but that may not actually be true. So certainly there are no real figures for that sort of thing. There are different issues. So some of the issues will be code related and sort of under the hood, because assistive technologies need to hook in and in order to make the content accessible. And then there will be a whole load of issues relating to the visual appearance that affect potentially everyone. There are many tools that people use to help them. So ranging from, there are built-in ones, there are things in your operating system, whether you're on Windows or Mac or mobile. There are built-in screen readers, magnifiers. There's the ability perhaps to change color schemes to a high contrast scheme. So a lot of that is built in if you need it. Then there are free browser extensions that perform all sorts of different functions. And then there's a whole range of products going up to very expensive professional tools, with the professional screen readers and magnifiers being around the best part of £1,000 plus annual costs. So people could be using anything in that whole range. Now, many people who are listening might have heard of screen readers and magnifiers. They're quite commonly known. But there are also a lot more, especially in the education sector, such as literacy tools that are aimed at people largely with dyslexia or learning difficulties, and OCR applications, that's optical character recognition, so that people can convert non-text content into something that's machine readable. So there's an absolutely vast range of tools out there.
It's quite amazing how the technology has transformed in the last few decades. I remember using something called a Macaton board, was like an alternative input device, and it cost many thousands of pounds. Now a lot of websites you can pick up your tablet and switch them into dark mode and get an alternative or high contrast theme, like almost built in, or Android devices and Windows will do transcription for you and read text out. A lot of those tools now are just kind of baked in and available. In terms of that set of assistive technologies and tools there, what are the particular ones that people should think about or be aware of? Because for most people, they don't realize that those tools are there, or if they've seen them, they don't realize that actually it's an assistive technology. And then what does that mean for what I'm building when I'm building a survey or a form?
So if you're talking about developers, I'd say to start with, they don't really need to know about all those things. Accessibility is an enormous topic, and they should be starting with the simpler things, like following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's a set of what they call success criteria that if you meet them all, what you've built should be reasonably accessible. And it's perfectly possible to follow all those guidelines and the technical specifications without really understanding why. That you just know that you have to mark up headings like this and mark up lists like that and put these ARIA attributes on these components. And as long as you follow the specification, it should pretty much work. So I would say the most important thing is to start learning all of that technical stuff. Then when you're happier with it, then perhaps go on and start learning about Most people start with a screen reader. There are some open source free ones around, like NVDA, and by all means start to learn about those. One of the mistakes that people do, and I say people, developers, one of the mistakes developers make is trying to make a screen reader sound a particular way, because they think that someone who uses a screen reader is going to want to hear certain things. And you shouldn't, as a general rule, design for how the screen reader behaves. You should be coding to standards. When you're really proficient at coding to standards, then you can start to take account of the actual screen reader behavior, or the other, whatever the assistive technology is. But you need a lot more understanding than you would have at the beginning. One of the reasons for that is you take screen readers, there are about 4 major ones for Windows, Mac, and mobile, and they all behave differently. And so if you code to standards, they should all work properly. If you try and code so that JAWS sounds like you think it should, who knows what the other ones are going to sound like? And so you can actually make the user experience worse for a lot of the audience, whilst trying to make it better for one small portion.
Yeah, it's very interesting. One of the things we've talked about internally and in building our mental frame for accessibility is having things work on the user's terms rather than on our terms, and that means letting people adapt it to what they need to do to be able to get access to the thing. I was using a restaurant app recently. There was it was a form-based thing. You could order from the table, which was a great bit of technology. Unfortunately, they chose a really very artistic font, but for me was very difficult to read. And they disabled the pinch to zoom that you get on tablet devices, so I couldn't zoom in on the font. It was a frustrating experience, because obviously a designer in that case had said, well, we want it to look this way and work this way, and taken away the ability for the users to adapt it to actually what they wanted to do, be in this case.
Yeah, another thing to remember is, the first time you use a screen reader, you will hear things that you're not expecting it to say. For instance, JAWS will say blank in between paragraphs. And I've had developers writing to forums saying, how can I stop JAWS from saying blank? And it's supposed to. And if you did stop it, and there are ways to stop it, and if you did, users would be very confused, because it's just doing on your website what it does on every other website. So people will be used to how their screen reader works on all the websites they visit. So actually, you want your website to be consistent with all the others, rather than trying to force a particular user experience.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, actually, is about seeing how other people have done it as well. I think a lot of accessibility people tend to work on their own. You have the great benefit of having a team and some real depth of expertise there. Oftentimes people are trying to solve this problem on their own, and there is that thing of having a look at what best practices out there and what other people have done and how they've solved some of the problems.
Oh, very much. And so we participate in the wider accessibility community a lot. There are a number of forums like WebAIM and the IAAP, which is a professional accessibility organization. So although we're competing with all these other companies, we actually come together on these forums and ask questions and give answers and share ideas and share things we've found. And that's absolutely invaluable. You don't want to be sort of isolating yourself on your own. The community is very collaborative.
It's a great community. In terms of people getting started So that, I'm thinking particularly people doing public consultations or doing public facing surveys, what are the most common mistakes that people make when they start to try and bake in accessibility and account for that in their designs?
Right. I think the first thing is actually not so much a mistake, but most of the problems arise from the use of JavaScript frameworks and the third-party plugins that go along with them. And nowadays, people would think you're weird if you built a website without using a JavaScript framework. But when we started back in sort of 2002, jQuery didn't exist back then, or not in any meaningful way. And you hand-coded every single line of code. Then came along jQuery and later things like Angular, React, and a whole bunch of other frameworks. And so a lot of stuff is built in. And nowadays, anyone building a website, the first thing they do is pick a framework. And as soon as they've done that, they've baked in a whole ton of accessibility problems, because all of the frameworks are horribly inaccessible. And even the ones that aren't so bad, the third-party plugins for them are terrible. And so even before you've written a line of your own code, you've already got a whole stack of problems there that you then need to strip out and fix. People who've been down that path will typically go through all the pain of fixing the framework and creating their own version of it that they then use for future projects. But first time round, there's no avoiding that pain unless you don't use a framework. The other major sort of generic thing that causes problems is developers trying to be too clever. Not really sure why they do this, but if there's like a simple way to do something, like using a native HTML element, and there's an insanely complicated way to do it, they will do it the insanely complicated way for whatever reason. And that always brings a whole load of accessibility problems. Now, I reckon that accessibility peaked around probably 2006, so 15, 16 years ago, and it's got progressively worse since then. And that's due to a combination of the JavaScript frameworks, but also code just getting more and more and more complicated, and developers trying to do so-called clever things for whatever reason. And just year on year, the accessibility gets worse and worse. And we thought it couldn't keep getting worse, but it does. So my advice is that if there is a simple way to do things and using native HTML elements, do it that way.
And for the less technical members of our audience, and what's going off under the hood here is oftentimes when you pull up a web page and look at it, in the original kind of development of the standards, it was literally the text that got put on the page with some styling around it. Whereas now what tends to happen is your browser loads up the page, it goes off and fetches megabytes of code, which then render the text onto the screen. So for a computer program looking at the screen rather than the user, what's there is changing all the time, and it can't work out what is readable text and what's hidden and what's put off the page. And so actually for the screen readers and assistive technologies, whilst the visual thing might look great with this sliding picture show and buttons coming in from the left, right, and all these beautiful things, actually it stops a lot of the accessibility tools working. And actually, even for people not using the tools, sometimes a lot of that visual movement can be quite off-putting or make the text difficult to process and read.
Absolutely. In the old days, you used to be able to very easily read the source code, and one thing on the page would correspond to one line of code, which might be a text box or a paragraph or something. Now that one thing on the screen might have 50 lines of code. that you had to read and work out what on earth is going on there. And yeah, we see, you mentioned things moving around. That has become much more prevalent in recent years with things like parallax scrolling, which makes me feel ill. And I know a lot of people don't like that. And pages where, as you scroll down, content seems to just fade in or slide in from the sides, and everything's moving. Even when you hover over links, the underline will slide in instead of just being there. Really don't know why designers do this, because it all adds extra code, extra potential problems. No user ever said, I really wish all the text slid in from the side instead of just being there. No one ever said that.
It's interesting as web browser technology has moved on that now increasingly there are settings to say, actually, I want high contrast, I prefer low movement, and actually users having to communicate to the designers and builders of the websites and the forums. It's like, please don't do these things. Please make it easy for me. And it's an interesting continuum as well for us. We think on the continuum through to inclusivity as well, because the reality is there are people out there who may have a very old machine and an incredibly slow rural broadband connection, might not even be broadband, might be a very 2.5G mobile connection or something, where actually the experience for those users of some of these things could be that a page takes 30, 40 seconds plus, sometimes even minutes to load, and goes beyond the capabilities of their machine in terms of the graphics it's trying to do, and that literally renders it unusable. So it's sounding like the doom mongers at the moment. So turning it around the other way. So what would you say people are doing really well in the accessibility domain in terms of kind of building surveys and forms and digital things at the moment?
Right. Well, obviously, you guys are doing really well. On the project that we did with you, you were able to fully conform with WCAG 2.1 AA, which is pretty challenging to do. Not many people get all the way there, and you did. So that was great. We've recently worked with another agency who are working on behalf of, I think it was the DWP, and they had a survey. Took a bit of beating into shape, but again, we got their 100% WCAG conformant. There really aren't that many good examples, and most of the ones I can think of are government related. And the reason for that is that certainly the newer government websites, by which I mean like central government, that they're built using the GovUK design system, which you can look it up online. It's open, anyone can use it, and indeed they encourage people to steal their code because they've built a component library of all the most commonly used components and design patterns. And not only have they got some really smart developers there, but all of the components have been extensively tested for cross-browser and accessibility. So it's very safe to use any components or design patterns that you find on there. And now it's been around a while, but I'm not sure how long, maybe 5-6 years, but it's obviously started off small, and only the newer websites have been built with it. So although all government websites look the same, they're not all coded the same. So some of them are really, really good for accessibility. Some of the older ones, less so. So that is really I'd say the biggest example of things done well. I really struggled to think of anyone else? I'm probably being unfair here. I'm sure there are some good examples, and I'm reluctant to sort of big up my own clients here, some of whom have done some exceptional work. But unfortunately, still most of the big brands out there are still not doing very well for accessibility. Some, like, and I will mention the BBC, going backwards. 10 years ago, the BBC were at the forefront among larger companies. They were doing accessibility really well. And sadly now, that's no longer the case.
And so the one thing we kind of skipped over and didn't talk about is why should people think about accessibility? Because I think you and I can take that a bit for a given. But why, if I'm trying to go to my boss, hey, we need to kind of invest in this and skill up in this. What's my pitch? Why is accessibility something that I need to do if I'm engaging with the public?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons. And when we're talking to people in an advocacy role, we try and work out, like, what's their hot button? Which one are they going to respond to? So we might start by saying, depending on what your website does, then having good accessibility might extend your marketing reach and maximize your sales. You might actually get some return. Difficult to quantify, but in principle, if more people can use your website, more people are likely to buy from you if you're selling online. So that's normally the first angle that we'd start with. It might minimize your support costs. If you're having to take calls or emails from people who can't use your website because of accessibility issues, then making it accessible potentially will reduce that support workload. Then you've got avoiding bad PR. So you'll never get good PR for having an accessible website, but you can certainly get bad PR for it. I remember in the early days, about 20 years ago, I won't say which one of the online banks, but one of the big ones, were horrified to find a quarter-page article in one of the broadsheet newspapers talking about how their online banking couldn't be used by people with disabilities. Seeing something like that in the press is just horrendous for the product owner. So you can avoid that sort of issue. And in fact, about 5 years after that, in the law world, one of the major publications there decided that all law firms should have accessible websites. Like, accessibility is the law, so law firms should be accessible. And they commissioned a company, not us, to do an accessibility test of the top 20 law firms' websites, one of whom was a client of ours. And they just got a phone call saying, we're publishing in 24 hours, you've got 24 hours to respond, and these are the problems we found on your site. And our client was actually possibly the biggest law firm in the world, and they went into panic stations at the idea that they were going to be criticised in their own trade press. So some of these are genuine issues. They're not theoretical. This really happens. Next issue, corporate social responsibility. Here we're getting a bit negative. You'd hope people would do accessibility just because it's the right thing to do, but a lot of people don't respond to that. And actually, CSR is probably the reason why, for the most part, the banks were very early adopters of accessibility. Going back 20 years ago, when almost no one was doing it, the banks were. And if only because it was a tick in the CSR box. So look, we're not big, nasty corporate giants. We actually do touchy-feely stuff for the benefit of everybody. Then the very last button that we push is the legal compliance button, because people rarely respond positively to that. If you go up to them and say, you need to make your website accessible because the law says you've got to, that gets people's back up. They don't like being told they've got to do something, even if it's actually true. So that is generally the very last thing that we do. And in terms of legal compliance, it's a bit of a confused landscape. If you're in the public sector, then it's very much the law. There is a specific public sector accessibility law that came in 2018. And crucially, it's got teeth, because the Government Digital Service pick about 1,500 public sector websites a year at random and test them. And if they find accessibility issues, you get a report saying you've got 3 months to fix it or there'll be trouble. That doesn't apply to the private sector, although it does apply to private sector suppliers of services to the public sector. So it indirectly applies. Also in the private sector, there is and always has been the Equality Act, and prior to that, the Disability Discrimination Act. And although that's been around for more than 25 years now, that doesn't have teeth. No one's monitoring it. And as a result, no one really paid much attention to it. There was the occasional court case, but generally only the very, very largest companies ever got taken to court for that. So it wasn't much of a threat. There's the possibility that a new law will come in for the private sector, like the public sector one, but we don't know if that'll happen, because the public sector one started as EU legislation that was transposed into UK law before we left the EU. And following down the tracks a few years behind is the public sector version. That will happen in the EU. We don't know. Our government here may or may not choose to adopt that or something similar.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the Disability Act and conversations that I've had recently with employers about reasonable adjustments. So again, it's certainly the case that employee could say, well, I need to use this website to do my job. It doesn't work with the tools that I use. Can we get this sorted out, please? Is a reasonable request.
It may be. The thing about the Equality Act is that it is all about reasonable adjustments, and a court will take into account all kinds of factors, like the number of people affected, the cost of fixing the issue, the life of the application. And so only a court can tell you if you're compliant or not. So that makes it a little bit difficult for any company to know if they're compliant. The difference with the public sector regulations is that simply says that your website has got to meet WCAG 2.1 AA. There's none of this reasonable adjustment thing. You've got to meet that. There is a disproportionate burden exemption, but you have to essentially put all the figures together to show that it would be disproportionately costly, whether financially or time-wise, to fix things. And anyone can request that assessment via an FOI request. So you can't just say, oh, it's a disproportionate burden. You can be held to account for it.
Yeah. So zooming back up your list from the compliance side has been interesting with our experience that actually putting the accessibility lens on. And one of the things we do oftentimes is we'll try a page or a design with a screen reader. And it's interesting how many times when we pick something up, it makes us go, well, hang on, actually, the text of that is not as clear as it could be, or not as concise as it could be, or actually could be laid out in a different way in terms of spacing between that actually putting that lens on helps us build something better for everybody. And for us, that helps push up completion rates and the quality of data we get back. So it's one of those things that actually building that skill set and going through the learning journey means that we're building a better product for everybody, regardless of their accessibility requirements. Is just making us think about, is this the best it could be in terms of how I use this when I put on different lenses in terms of, maybe reading's overwhelming for me, or maybe I'm using this on a really small screen. Is another example, is being accessible across a really broad range of devices, that there is this kind of rising tide of it actually improves everything. And there's a lot of talk about user experience at the moment, and the user experience design is exploding. For us, accessibility has been a very concrete goal around user experience that we can work to and put on different lenses for different users to think, how would this be for this person or this group of people? So a question that we get asked from time to time is, should we create a set of rules to follow that ensure that all surveys meet an accessibility standard? And we talked a little bit earlier on there. There's the technical bits of it. There's kind of the bits and bytes that happen. And then there's what I would call the content bits, so the questions that people write and how they kind of lay those out. So what's your thought on that? Is there a kind of golden set of rules, or how do you approach baking this in almost at a policy level, as it were?
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on survey construction. I'd say the web content accessibility guidelines already exist, and to some extent you don't really need to do more than that. But I'm certain there will be like writing guidelines for how you write your questions. But that is way outside of my expertise.
And like how people use media as well is like I know you don't get that very often, interestingly, in surveys. There is still the whole thing of, we still see lots of things where people put kind of very rich content in there that's not necessarily accessible. That again should be kind of a well-known thing, but yeah, it's less so. Are there any particular tools or techniques that you'd recommend people would use, either to kind of up their knowledge or kind of help them start to make some assessments ahead of bringing in experts to look at things?
I'm tempted to say no to that. What I generally advise people to do, if they want to go down the path of learning about accessibility, is rather than try and go and learn about it generically, actually, because it's such an enormous topic, and you can spend a lot of time learning about things that you'll never use, actually, you're better off getting a small amount of testing done on a real product where it's going to have real benefit to you. Maybe only a couple of days testing by a specialist company or a specialist freelancer, maybe. And then looking at all of the issues that arise from it, and in particular, how they need to be addressed. Because even a very small project testing, maybe 10 pages, you might find that you've got 20 or 30 issues to fix across perhaps 10 different types of issues, some of which could be visual, things like color contrast. Others could be under the hood, like semantic structure or JavaScript related things. And you will have to learn how to fix 10 different types of issues, and that will then take you into all the technical specifications for the different elements and ARIA roles and everything. And that will generate plenty of stuff to study, but it all has an immediate impact. And it's like a bite-size thing. It's easily digestible. And so you can implement those changes. Within a couple of weeks, you've now improved your website tangibly, you've learnt some techniques, and then do the same thing again. Test something else, learn some new techniques. And that way, everything you learn is relevant to what you do, and it gets embedded because you're doing it. Whereas if you start to study stuff that you're not actually using, you'll just forget it, because some of it's pretty esoteric. As for using tools, you need to be careful there, because although you could download a screen reader or a magnifier or Dragon voice recognition software or something, if you start to use it without having had professional training, you'll probably be using it wrongly. And you'll probably come to the wrong conclusion about your website and make the wrong changes to it. So if you are going to use assistive technologies, I recommend actually paying for professional training, which might only be like half a day, a few £100. That's what I did when I started this way back in the day, because there was nothing on the web back then. You couldn't read any articles about screen readers. There wasn't anything. So I just paid professional trainers to teach me how to do it. And then in terms of testing tools, because there are some automated tools for testing website accessibility, the problem with those is they can only do a small proportion of the tests that need doing. So they give you a false indication that everything's okay when it isn't. They also have false positives, so they'll tell you something's wrong when it's not. And you need experience to know when the tools are lying to you. Of course, in the early days, you won't have that experience. So I'd be very wary of sort of trying to do things on your own before engaging with an accessibility professional. And I'm not trying to sell our services here.
You're reminding me of the 3 levels of mastery, which was explained to me once as know the rules, know when to break the rules, make the rules. And it is interesting that quite a bit of accessibility is craft and art almost, is that experience to know, well, I've got a warning about this, but actually here that's not going to be a problem for users, whereas this will be. And again, a lot of this comes back to connecting with users, and we've certainly benefited from some of our bigger customers have internal stakeholder groups who are very good at kind of collecting together feedback and going, yeah, here's the challenges we've experienced in our environment, because there's always interactions with the fun things that IT have put on their machines and the tools that they're using. So on that, the thing that comes up from time to time is people ask, what is an accessibility statement? Because they come across this term and they're like, well, what's an accessibility statement? Do I need one? How do I get it? So what, for people who are new to that, what's an accessibility statement? Where is that kind of applicable?
Right. So an accessibility statement is, well, I suppose it depends on your context, really, but I'll deal with the context in which it comes up mostly. So in most cases, it's a web page that explains how accessible your website is. It'll list the things that you can do, such as zooming the page to 400% without content overlapping or getting truncated. And it'll list all of the known accessibility issues and the impact on you. So you can know, if you read it before you use a website, you will know what you can and can't do. If there are any, because with a lot of websites that they might be largely accessible, but there might be specific things that are not. Like videos might not have captions, or perhaps there might be some documents attached that are not accessible. So the accessibility statement will tell you that, so that as you go through the website, you know when you come to a document that it might not be accessible to you. The accessibility statement should contain contact details in case users need help or if they want to report an accessibility issue. And ideally, it should also contain a roadmap that states when you're going to fix the known issues, or if you don't plan to fix any of them. So you'll find accessibility statements like this on all of the public sector websites that I mentioned. It's actually a requirement of the law that came in, that so they all have this, and they all have to be updated every year. There are other types of accessibility statement, or to use the full term, accessibility conformance statement. The statement that I've just described is intended for the benefit of users. It's on the website in question. The other type of conformance statement is known as a VPAT, which stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And that is intended for buyers. And it contains some of the same information, but it contains a lot of technical stuff, and that won't be on the website. Generally, that is something that a third-party software supplier like your company and people like Microsoft and Adobe, they will have VPATs for all of their products or SaaS services. And if anyone is thinking of buying or subscribing to those products and services, they can call up Microsoft or whoever and say, please send me your VPAT for Microsoft Office. And it'll get emailed over, or it might actually be on a website somewhere. And the idea is that it's a standardized format that a buyer can look at. If he's thinking of 3 different products he might buy, you can put the VPAT side by side and decide which is the most accessible. So that the VPAT is not intended for users. So it's an entirely different purpose. So those are essentially the 2 types of accessibility statement.
That's super helpful. I think one of the things there is that a minimum takeaway is the whole contact piece. I've been surprised a number of times I've used something and see something really obvious that makes it hard to use. Like, I would like to tell somebody, and you can't find a way to do that. So accessibility statements, if nothing else, are useful from that point of view of this is a problem we know about, and if you spotted something different, you've got a contact point there to get help as well. And again, for us, that's one of the things about trying to make sure that users can get help when they need it if we've missed something as well, because you're not always going to get everything. There's always unique twists of tools that you haven't come across before, or a specific disability that perhaps impacts in a different way that you haven't considered in the design of the survey or the platform.
It's worth remembering that although almost everyone aims to meet WCAG 2.1 AA, and when you get there you think, oh, fantastic, we've achieved full conformance, there are another 28 requirements at level AAA that you probably haven't met, and then there are all of the user needs that aren't addressed by WCAG at all for various reasons. So although meeting AA is great, it by no means guarantees that your website or mobile app is going to be accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and that whole experience thing, again, for us, a big part of the journey is the impact on the content that people put in. So how you ask questions, the question types that you choose. Whilst you can be technically compliant, you can build something that's actually quite hard for people to use. If you used a drop-down question with 100 question choices, that's probably difficult for most people. But if you're using that with a screen reader, you're going to be there for 10, 15 minutes whilst it's reading through the choices, and it's just not a pleasant experience. Whereas actually you can step back and go, well, can we break this into 2 or 3 questions, or use a different question type just to make that a bit more friendly? And again, everyone benefits, not just folks using screen readers. Everybody gets a better experience as a result of that process. So your team have been invaluable in terms of helping us up our expertise, and really pushing us on moving forward accessibility. I mean, I'm very encouraged these days by, if I go back even just 3-4 years, both in the public sector and the commercial sector, it was not something people talked about, and we always kind of built it into the product, and we'd tell people we'd done that, but nobody was interested. Now, actually, even in the last few days, actually every conversation it's come up, like, is this accessible? Has it been tested for accessibility? How do I build surveys that are accessible? There's a much more of an appetite to actually try and build services and experiences that are accessible to as broad a range of people as possible, which is, there is some hope. Whilst the technology might be making it harder, there is an increasing desire to be more user-centric in what people build, which is encouraging.
Certainly, if you're a third-party supplier to the public sector, then you can expect them at some point to insist that your service is not just accessible, but you can show that it is. So the public sector started by sorting out their own websites, and that's taken like 3 or 4 years. But now they are very much starting to focus on all their third-party suppliers, and we've worked for quite a number of people in your sort of situation who've suddenly been told, if you can't make your website WCAG conformant, well, we're not going to be able to use you. We'll have to get someone else's service. So it could well be an issue for anyone in the private sector who supplies the public sector.
Well, it's definitely something to focus the mind. Well, thank you very much for your time, Stephen. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you. We will include links for people for a lot of the things that we've mentioned here, and also for the podcast as well. And hopefully we'll speak to you again sometime. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.